This
reuse,
conference will now be
remanufacture,
recorded.
refurbishing and recycling. So the advocates claim that the circular economy is to bring about perfect circles of slow material flows and to prompt a shift from consumers to users to enable us to do this decoupling of resource use and the impact on the environment and economic growth. So the advocates really claim that the benefits are convincing both in terms of the environment and the economy.
It's quite fascinating. Something quite fascinating about the circular economy is how rapidly it has developed. I mean, it started as a quite confidential theoretical concept in the 90s, but very rapidly from the beginning of the 2000s, because it was endorsed by the People's Republic in China, but definitely from the beginning of the 2010s in Europe and Northern America, it developed rapidly. Actually, I think it's the fastest, I would say, the fastest development of a concept in business administration that I've been able to see, much faster than, for example, CSR, much faster than things, even like business process reengineering, which were really sort of very rapid fashion, much faster even than the quality and lean movement. So the circular economy really gained a momentum with European Union, with the World Economic Forum, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation was decisive in this, and I think that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been really working first with McKinsey, very, I would say, dynamic. But it's very interesting to see how many different companies and different contexts they're coming from a sort of paying an interest, and regions and cities. And among other things, I think it's interesting in itself, the rapid, I would say, the rapid interest, the rise of interest for the circular economy is a topic of interest in itself. Why so rapidly? Why the concept? Why now? I think a very important question. And that's maybe kind of an entry also in our interest for the critique. It's interesting to understand, why do we have something raising so fast? And it's such a widespread support. But, Alison?
But we also have seen that there are many objections, and some of these are known and some of them are well less known. And these objections, and Hervé's already mentioned how many papers that we went through, are the criticisms that are coming from researchers and practitioners. So, you know, these are really scattered, just to re-emphasize that, over different fields, ranging from ecological economics, management, human geography. What we've done is tried to thematize these, and we're going to go through each one to share some of the insights from what these researchers and practitioners have said.
So we give our voice to the people who have been criticizing the circular economy, and which is why in our presentation we are very careful to cite people directly, as we would do, as we have done in the paper. So the first critiques, I would say, the first category of critiques coming from the complexities attached with the definition of the circular economy. And the circular economy has been considered to be a refurbished concept than something completely new. And I think that's quite interesting, because it is really sort of often represented as something radically new, but the question that how new it is. And for example, in Sweden, there's been a very large interest for something called Kretslop, which is Kreislauf in German, and which is the idea of circularity. And you will find actually people speaking about a circular circulation of things and material going back, for example, in Germany to the 1940s. And so that's the first point, the question of novelty. It's also something which has been emphasized, is that the circular economy is drawing on very different sources of inspiration, such as the performance economy, biomimicry, and many other things. But it's not a problem in itself unless you start to pay some interest to the fact that those different sources of inspiration might not be easy to conciliate and to combine. because they have very different purposes and they have very different backgrounds, origins, and even, I would say, priorities and ontologies. Something also which has been emphasized and taken up by many authors is that the circular economy is sort of bringing a focus on the management of resources. And when you sort of move from the management of resources to individual strategies of consumers or companies or regions, cities or states, then there is something which is happening here and which is not very clear. There is a kind of a implicit agenda about a focus on resource management, which is not always explicit. Quite generally, the circular economy has been called to be a vague narrative, an horizon, something that you are sort of moving toward, but by definition never reach. Something as being a floating signifier, which is changing its meaning according to who you ask, and even an empty signifier, which is lacking any substance of its own, by a critic, by Valenzuela and Bohm. So we have this complexity attacks with definition. That's the first theme of the critiques that we have been sort of organizing. Thank you.
The second theme then that comes out relates to neglecting established knowledge, contrary to teachings that we've already had. And there's a reoccurrent critique in there, and we start with the ones around the laws of thermodynamics. I mean, this law indicates that one cannot create or destroy matter. It can only be converted or dispersed. So one of the things that comes into question then is a circular economy future where waste no longer exists and where we have these material loops closed, and we can products can then be recycled indefinitely, appears, sort of in this understanding as a practical impossibility. So the next area within this neglect of knowledge, I need to put my teeth in, there appears to be a lack of recognition of some of the limits to the material properties and current manufacturing and reprocessing technologies that we have available. Not all materials can be reused or reprocessed, and some will disperse into the environment. Others can be contaminated or wear down. Single-use plastics is a good example here. There's also concern about the complexities of current waste management and recapturing discarded resources. It appears, sort of within the circular economy agenda, that this underestimates the practical difficulties for how we do actually recapture these materials back into the processes. And also not paying attention to the reality of new waste streams appearing all the time, and how they'll actually feed into the systems. There's also critiques from Traven, for example, that indicate that the circular economy advocates overlook the volatility of things like the recycling market, and the fact that toxic wastes cannot be recirculated. So currently a substantial share of waste too is not processed in country, and it can make its way to informal economies. And again, this appears overlooked. So contrary to what the advocates indicate then, there also is a need for further understanding around consumption practices. A lot of the focus around consumption focuses on consumers purchasing or recycling. And there seems to be limited consideration of the implications of how consumers are going to move from being owners of the products to users of the products. There's almost like this expectation, so the critiques indicate, that consumers will have to accept all changes created by designers, engineers, business and policymakers. Now, within that too, there is also the challenge around how, a lack of appreciation of the volume of consumed materials that are stocked in existing infrastructures, in organisations and in homes. The research seems to focus on material flows rather than stocks. We all hoard things. Well, maybe we don't all, but I'd speak for myself. We all hoard things. If you think how many mobile phones or technology you have in your home. So the challenge with overlooking stocks and focusing on the flow is we have the potential too of ignoring the rebound effect. You know, this could encourage environmental savings on one side, but actually create negative effects overall. So these are the areas around what the critiques are saying, where we're neglecting established knowledge.
So I think it's becoming maybe clearer that pretty much of the critiques say that the circular economy is quite ignorant of the past and of the difficulties of managing the legacy of hundreds of years of at least 100 years of intensive production. But even when we look at the future, there is an unclear implementability, and these are three different levels of policy, organizations, and individual. It's very unclear, for example, even if you look at the European Union, what are the boundary limits? Are we speaking about a circular economy just for the Union? Are we speaking about the European Union contributing to a global circularity? And there is also a very clear critique about the fact that the circular economy is a typically kind of a top-down procedures of policy development, and without being overcritical about the European Union policies, we have there is at least coming from political science very big concerns about the long-term efficiency and implementability of top-down policies. When you look at organizational level, it's very clear that you have very different things which are being called circular business model and circular transition. And again, we are back to this idea that it's not clear what the circular economy is about. And if it's very unclear what circularity is about, it's also very unclear what is a circular business model and what is not, with possibilities of circular washing, for example, and difficulties to assess what are the contribution of circularities. There was a paper by Boken, for example, that I received this weekend. That says, well, companies have very big difficulties to assess the impact of their circular efforts. Yes, because maybe they don't really know what they're speaking about. And it's also the fact that you can have a company with some circular activities and maintaining the rest very linear. And here, for example, I've been studying with my colleague Herman Stowell. We have been studying the fast fashion sector in Sweden on several occasions, and it's very clear that on the side of a very strong, I would say, rhetorical commitment to the circular economy, but even practical commitment to the circular economy, where they develop take-back systems and plenty of measures, basically those people remain basically linear. So we have a selected information. We have some kind of development of circular economy in a compartment, but the core of the activity remains linear. So the question is, what is going to happen with these linear things? And you can even reproduce this reasoning on the global value chains, because you might have, in a way, something very linear, and then a couple of loops, and then it's picking up, continuing being linear. Something which also has been sort of emphasized is that circularity is very often developed as a kind of a project, a kind of a pilot, and there is difficulty to scale it up, which is sort of taking up this idea of the challenge for companies to become completely circular, as opposed to circular in part, or maybe they are circular in part of their products. And this leading to a concern which was expressed very early by Lund and Villander, because the paper was published in 2017, but there must have been a big backlog in the journal, because the first version of the paper was 2015 already, where the fact is mentioned that it's very difficult to validate and to know what is circularity in practice. But even if you go at the individual level, circularity is rather unknown by customers. Of course, in the room here, in the room here, everybody knows it. But if you go out on the street and ask people about the circular economy, you might be surprised to see that very many people don't really know what it is. And it's not necessarily valued by customers. The willingness to pay has been measured as rather low, and people are not ready, for example, to pay an extra price for circularity, the same way that they are ready to pay an extra price for sustainability. And considering the fact that circularity might involve an extra job by the consumers, for example, of taking care, tracking, and leaving back the products in a way, there might be there might be some kind of a negative approach, negative resistance of the consumers. It's also the fact that circular economy is raising very important issues of ownership. Just to give you an idea, for example, if you consider the fact of platform and music sharing platform, and you compare the idea of owning your records and again having an access to a music sharing platform, such as, for example, the Swedish Spotify, to do some advertisement. The point is that the moment you do not subscribe any longer, you do not have access to the music. You cannot sort of rest on a stock of things that you own, meaning that in a way you are in need of a permanent flow of income to match a permanent flow of access. And this is very important. So it really raises issue of ownership, and considering the central role of ownership for development of capitalism, on this account, the circular economy is sort of negating a central pillar of an economy which it insists to be participating to. And this is a kind of critique which I think are very important, because I think as academics, it's our role to point at things which are not made clear, but nevertheless important. And there is also something which is important for the circular economy. It's really opening for increased corporate power. Because, for example, if you have the company sort of gaining and not gaining access about your product. But again, if I continue with Spotify, for example, Spotify will, for example, track exactly what you are listening to offer you the list of the week. They have a very good knowledge about what you are listening to. For example, if you compare this with most public libraries in European countries, they're not allowed to make a list of what you're reading in terms of personal integrity. There is such an incredible discrepancy between the fact that if you go to a library, your public library or your university library will not stock, is not allowed to stock the books that you have been borrowing, but Spotify will make a business out of it and even sort of make it as a kind of advantage. It's really an increased corporate power. And the same, it's a question about who is offered and not offered. And we know, for example, the role of all those sharing platforms, for example, in the tourism industry, about the size of the added value that they are sort of taking just to make, for example, the services of a hotel available is really an issue. So there is a lot of issues about implementability, which I think are central and should be of interest just for your project, since it's focused on transition. Thank you, Alison.
And I think there's something worth noting, and I meant to mention it earlier, that when we're talking about our paper, most of our critiques are focused on the European understanding of circularity. And there are, within the paper that we developed, one of the areas that they said that was underdeveloped was actually insights from the Global South. And I just wanted to raise that there. So we need clearer understandings there. So I think this is the fourth area of critiques that I'm going to talk through. And this is around sort of the clarity of environmental contributions. I mean, the circular economy comes with significant promises around green growth. You know, we've already mentioned it's about decoupling growth from environmental impact, building circular material flows, as Blum and his colleagues indicate. It's seen as a means whereby decoupling takes place, but should not be the end in itself. So questions of whether the circular economy will lead to a more sustainable growth or simply more growth is still an area that really needs to be explored. The understandings within these critiques often appear blurred, and the criticisms point out that the circular economy becomes underpinned with an extensive set of risks, but every risk has an opportunity. So, for example, in Ingo and Block's paper, they discuss the focus on resource base and waste sink functions, that there's a tendency to ignore the amenity base and the life support feature of the surrounding environment. The accounts indicate that there's also a lack of appreciation for the complex networks and flows required to sustain the functionality of the biosphere within which the economy is operating. Also within this sort of area as well, there appears to be an underestimation of the challenges to make a sustainable world, you know, with a focus on a small fraction of materials. For example, if you explore some of the industry documents around circularity, there seems to be a focus on things like cement, plastics, and other materials. You know, there's normally about 8 of them. So this makes it difficult then, so the criticisms say, to measure environmental impacts, especially over short and long-term periods, and that are attached with reuse, remanufacturing and recycling. Now, Skene points out that the circular economy reminds us about the larger geographical scales and also fragmented value chains involved in how products are produced, consumed and disposed of. The recapture and reuse of discarded resources then becomes challenging and requires a global reorganization. I mean, you can think about how your computer or your laptop's put together. Parts are made in all different factory sites, and then they come together and are put together in another, and then they're sold in different ways. So trying to sort of track where these products are going and getting them back in the system is a large-scale affair. So also then, some argue that the circular economy then only delays and doesn't really eliminate environmental impacts of what the circular economy label the linear economy. You know, the researchers argue that, you know, what's actually happening here is that the circular systems aren't necessarily any more environmentally friendly than the linear system that we currently have.
And to add to what Alison said about the environment, it's even more unclear social contribution. It's really unclear how the circular economy is leading to greater social equality if, for example, there will be more equality between generation, or, for example, how the circular economy will impact on gender equality, racial or religious equality, or other diversity. And for example, imagine the impact that we already see today on the labor legislation and the labor condition of the platform as a gig economy. All those people sort of delivering food at home on a bike, for example, has been sort of, and all the Uberization of the economy, it has already a very strong impact. But imagine also what is happening with the customers and the digital divide, and for example, the people who might and might not be included or excluded in the circular economy. Imagine, for example, what will happen with customer with a bad circular rating. And so there are plenty of sort of social and environmental impacts which are sort of assumed but never proven, and it's very important to bring those forth. Thank you, Alison.
So the last area then really is a more theoretical area, and the circular economy is seen as an ideological agenda. I mean, the metaphor of the circular economy is very enticing, and it remains unclear, you know, raising all sorts of questions as to what is it that shall be circular, and can a circular economy bring a perfect circle? I mean, the appeal to policy makers appears strong within these critiques, and due to the focus that there seems a possibility to create this win-win scenario and bring synergies together and opportunities, you know, under the guise almost of this suitable policy framework. But what the critiques do point out is that it doesn't include what compromises, as Hervé has just indicated, with the social elements need to be made. What problems or constraints there are. I mean, the criticisms do suggest that for many, it's becoming a buzzword around circular economy. So it's almost seen like a greenification, you know, circular business, circular innovation. Now, some of the objections too highlight how the circular economy policy rests on markets and corporations as driving forces. And this becomes very wedded then to neoclassical and conventional economics, that there's a trust that the market and efficiency will save us. And I think Hervé's already mentioned his and Herman's paper on fashion, and they point out in this paper how circular initiatives preempt material and environmental policies. I mean, other examples also include the zero waste economy, the adoption of green technology and digital infrastructures, or investments in infrastructures, as Savini points out in their paper on circular economy and policies in the Netherlands and Amsterdam. Now, Hervé mentioned at the start, and so did Andreas, that in our paper, some of the critiques argue that the circular economy depoliticizes industrial and environmental policy. And the depoliticization entails two things. One, that the economy is a technical matter, and that companies are the ones that are able to engineer this social change. That's the second one, sorry. So this depoliticization occurs because the circular economy is presented as a managerial and technocratic matter of fact. And these are issues that Niskanen and colleagues point to. Now, there too here is a growing body of research that criticizes the absence of socio-cultural and political issues and thinking through what type of jobs this will create. I mean, will it be more sorting and separating jobs as we need the materials back? So there is really a failure then to recognize that these connections could contribute to objections raised with labour practices as they are overlooked. Hervé has already indicated there's challenges around power asymmetries, interdependencies, political and economic constraints, plus issues of equity and inclusion. And examples can be those working in areas such as salvaging, repairing, reuse, and often undertaken outside of the formal economies by socially marginalised groups. So what we can see then is in this particular area is that the circular economy is an attractive concept that promises that everybody will benefit from its implementation. But we can see that we're starting to get a sense from what the researchers were arguing and the practitioners, that there are two compromises, there are two problems and constraints that will entail if we follow the agenda as is.
You have to understand in which way, which sense we mean critique here, because it seems that we're just sort of aligning a long range of complaints about the circular economy, but that's not how we see it. And here we sort of rest on Michel Foucault's understanding of critique, where a critique, quote, does not consist in saying that things are not good as they are. It consists in seeing what kind of self-evidences, liberties acquired, and non-reflective modes of thought the practice we accept rest on. And that's what we think is very important. We're sort of bringing forth all this consent which have been made and raised about the circular economy, because it's a way of sort of showing that there's a need to rethink a certain amount of things when you speak about the circular economy, to bring forth, to debunk some incoherencies, incompleteness, hidden assumption, unsort of consequences and the like. For example, you cannot just simply assume that corporations are the solution without sort of taking into account that they have been, for example, largely responsible for the poor state of the world today. When, for example, I see that in the Swedish delegation for circular economy, one of the corporate members is a Coca-Cola company. And when I also read that the Coca-Cola company has been found to be, by a very large survey about waste speakers all across the world, as the #1 company producing plastic waste, I think there is something to point at here, which is very important. And I can understand that the Coca-Cola company is very interesting in sort of getting at the problem where they are very responsible for it. But just assuming that the company which creating the problem will also be the companies which is solving it is something which is in itself an assumption in it. So being open, and I think that's the role of critique and the role of academic critique. So it's not a question of saying that the circular economy is not something good in itself. It's more a question about pointing at the part of the discourse, pointing at the part of the theorizing, pointing at the part of the implementation efforts that show that we need to think more. And this is where we want to sort of direct the attention. We believe that all this critique is pointing at a kind of transformative agenda of the circular economy. Alison, please.
So where does this leave us then? You know, what can we learn from the critiques of the circular economy? Now, what we know is the objections to the circular economy show that despite the strong imaginary appeal, there is a big tendency to ignore the principles of biophysics, and there are tensions between basic biophysical principles, the limits of the progress and growth. So using the circular economy as a buzzword then becomes problematic. I mean, it can be seen as vague and uncontroversial. Critics see in the circular economy a reassuring discourse, for example, for policy, future plans and circular modernisation. Now, the criticisms from the practitioners and researchers does call into question the very notion of circularity. And as Hervé's already mentioned, you know, they're showing that there are inconsistencies, hidden assumptions and unclear consequences that need to be worked through. And what these criticisms are showcasing then is the need to keep questioning. You know, how do we know what a circular solution is good for the environment? Or how do we know that a circular solution is good for the environment? You know, how do we transform social institutions attached to modernity and the current path dependencies? You know, how do we create an inclusive economy? And will it phase out the linear economy or will it recreate it? So what these critiques then and what we've concluded in the paper then is for a truly sustainable economy that is circular. These objections show that radical shifts are required that confront neoliberal governance regimes. Open dialogue needs to continue to avoid normalization, which could get rid of spaces for critical reflection. So we conclude then, you know, sort of to move forward, you know, each of these areas we've outlined points to issues that need further research, policy and managerial attention. Now, Hervé and I as academics, we offer the plea that, you know, there is a need for transdisciplinarity. I mean, this could offer further coherence about definitions, plans, implementations and modes of evaluation. And this could encourage new knowledge instead of deadlocks in debate. You know, moving out of disciplinary silos can enable us to respond and come up with solutions that would enrich the development of more robust circular solutions. You know, otherwise the circular economy risks turning into a hypothetico-normative utopia that derails actual and well-intended efforts to reorganize consumption and production systems, and more generally material flows in ways that are respectful of planetary and social boundaries that work in favor of sustainability. So in the paper, you know, we put forward this conclusion, you know, a pathway towards circularity would be a circular economy that is modest, not a panacea, but an actual solution to actual problems. Concrete in the sense of being clear about which kind of circularity it sets up and the goal conflicts that it entails. It be inclusive in that it takes energy, people and waste on a global scale into consideration, and transparent in the sense of being accountable for its achievements and shortcomings, not the least when it comes to economic, social and environmental changes. So on behalf of Hervé, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention And here is the reference to our paper that's open access if you want to explore a little further about this. And thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Alison and Hervé, for this great presentation. I'm sure there will be many questions from our ESRs. So if you want to book for a question, please write your name in the chat. I can see that there are already some people with their screens on, so maybe they
Can
want
I ask
to...
how you stop sharing a screen?
Yeah, well, you should just, I can do it for you. I suppose, no, yeah, just click again. Yeah, okay, that's fine. We've done it. Okay, so Tommaso, do you want to ask a question? Or... Was just your cam was on? Oh, okay. Okay, well, I have a question. If you know, if that helps to try to break the ice. I don't know, Hervé and Alison, if you came across that recent paper. Cannot remember if it was cited in yours from Thomas Bowens and colleagues, who essentially have conceptualized sort of alternative circular futures. So they acknowledge that essentially in the future we might have many even challenging definitions and implementations of a circular economy, starting from the fact that circular economy is a contested concept. And essentially they developed 4 scenarios, one essentially based on a free market economy, one based on a command economy, if you want, and then 2 sort of intermediate scenarios, one more based on degrowth and one based on a sort of platform capitalism. I don't know if you have come across that work. If yes, what do you think about it? If not, I mean, do you think it would be a promising research area, you know, these sort of futuring exercises, trying to acknowledge, on the one hand, that there might be multiple implementations of circular economy, as you also seem to suggest, and also trying to understand more about what sort of circular economies we might have in the future, because there might also be appropriation attempts, like it happened, for instance, you know, with the sharing economy. Great concept, great potential, but then it was co-opted by corporations and became something else. So really wanted to know your view regarding this.
Yes, we cite it. Yes, we have read it. I would not be able to answer about the details of it just right now, because as I explained, that we have been going through it. But there is one thing that I remember about this paper, and actually there is even a report on circular economy developed by my colleagues at KTH in Stockholm, which is along the same line. That's meaning that instead of speaking of circular economy in singular, we should be speaking about circular economy in plural, because the concept is sort of branching in very different practices. And that, for example, insisting on the one hand on the planned character, as Bowens and colleagues do, I think is important, because then you have the idea of sort of having a more directive view about the economy, where the circular economy is not relying on the market. And then you have this idea about the the platform view. But for example, I would not put the idea of developing platform with developing a more planned economy on the same level. And I think that the paper about Bowen is sort of putting different scenarios, but I wish I would not be sort of putting at different levels, the same level. But something which I think, Alison, sorry if I speak in the name of the three of us, but I think that we agree on this in the sense that it's important to know what kind of problem the circular economy is addressing and what kind of solution is it bringing to the specific problem. So for example, if the problem is that you will have a stock of material which is underused and that there is a need to make this material available to more than one person and develop ways of communication among users, for example, for sharing, so that you have a reduction of material flow, because instead of having 100 person owning 100 single exemplary or maybe more than one exemplary of each, then you have a lesser amount of people, and then there will be sort of sharing this, which will take less room, less material, and we'll even have other aspects about communication is important. So I think that's interesting to see. So here we have, for example, a peer-to-peer, but what will circularity will give? But as opposed, for example, to a planned economy, where, for example, we see the European Union putting very clear requests on manufacturers, for example, of cars, but even in textile, there is an extended producer responsibility for textile, which is coming up, and even for electronics, we're sort of moving more towards sort of a planned economy. And I think that's a good point in a way, in the idea of bringing out different kind of solutions to different kind of problems based on the general framework of circularity, but then being clear. We bring this solution to this problem, and not having this kind of very generous, the circular economy is a solution to every kind of evils on Earth. Among other things, because the circular economy is at most relevant for part of the future production, and very little answer about the huge stock, about all the houses where we live, all the offices where we are right now, all the stuff that we have been accumulating. It's huge quantity. It's very dangerous stuff very often, and we have no idea about what to do about it. And most likely it's going to end up, if it's dangerous with little value, sorry to be cynical, but there is a very big risk that it will end up in countries where people are even less able to take care of them. So I think it's the idea of plurality is very interesting. And I think that the idea of sort of keeping the circularity as a kind of general idea about circulation of material instead of extraction, use, disposal, idea of reusing material, which is actually going back to a time where we were less rich and more careful about the stuff we had. And when I mean we, I also mean that the circular economy is already a reality for many people who cannot afford linearity. So yes, in a way, but that's very tough to discuss a single paper just like this.
Can I just add something to that? And I know we've got also a question in the chat too. But with regards to that paper, you know, I do really like it. It gives a nice history behind how these ideas came on the agenda. And like Hervé said, I think the notion of pluralities, or the plurality of sort of different understandings of circular economy is great. But each of those frameworks in the typology presented have specific outcomes. And so I think it's really important, as Hervé said, to think about what the solution is, because if you subscribe to one of those typologies in the paper, and then that is going to have some specific implications for the limits of whether we're operating in sort of the biosphere, you know, the planetary boundaries, and so on and so forth. They have very different indications.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Alison. Appreciate your answer. There is a question from Giuseppe, which I think is along the same lines, Giuseppe, do you want to raise the question yourself, maybe adding more details based on what we have been discussing so far?
Yeah, sure. I mean, because I came across a lot of this literature and these criticisms when doing one of my papers as well. And one of the challenges is that how could I classify these criticisms according to the different conceptualizations of the circular economy? And to me, that was a challenge because, of course, as the paper of Bowen says, that there's many ways to understand the circular economy. And some of these criticisms, they weigh differently, or they may not even apply because some conceptualizations or some stakeholders do, for instance, define a social agenda, or they try to at least. So it's different according to who defines the circular economy. So I was wondering if you came across this challenge, or did you consider how to address that, the lack of definition in circular economy in the criticisms?
Do you like me to go first, Hervé? Okay. I think in our paper, that was one of the themes, the challenges around defining it. They all have different starting points. And there was one paper that looked at over 114 different definitions. And I personally think, and I can't speak for Hervé, that when you define anything, you define it in accordance to particular sources of inspiration. As Hervé mentioned, in some of the definitions, it's coming from the performance economy, biomimicry, resilience science, and so forth. And depending on that inspiration will depend on how it's defined. So you're never going to really you might be looking for commonalities between definitions of circularity, but they'll all have different starting points depending on what inspirations they're being sourced for, which will give different end goals. So, I mean, there is one paper that did actually investigate sort of over 114 definitions, which might give you some insights into that, which I'll pop the reference in the chat for you now.
I wasn't sure we had time to answer, so I answered that the criticisms are just as diverse in their target as the circular economy is, which was kind of a challenge, a sort of gathering this critique. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the circular economy can very easily say, well, this kind of critique is not relevant for me because I am different here and different there. And sort of this multiplicity of definition, which is really emphasized by many critics, is sort of going all through the critique against the circular economy because it's not always clear what we're speaking about. And I think that's part of the academic approach of working with something like the circular economy. It's just to sort of work toward clarity, because this is where I think we are different from practitioners, because you can sort of develop something and not having some kind of conceptual clarity about what you are dealing with, because you are actually working with it and you develop it, but we have a slightly different role. I like to say that a question I'm asking very often to sort of discuss and answer a little bit to your concern, Giuseppe, that as the people who say, well, I'm doing with circular economy, and say, okay, I'm ready to accept it, but show me your circle. That's really kind of question I'm asking all the time, is show me your circle. Because when you have shown me the circle you want to build, then we can start to discuss in more concrete terms and to know which kind of critique are relevant and not. Then we can discuss time scale. We can discuss, for example, the fact that are we speaking about a circularity which is uniform for all parts of the products, or are we speaking part of the product with a circularity which is faster than the other one? Are we which kind of spatial scale are we speaking of? What are the environmental benefits? What are the environmental costs of this circularity? What is the social impact? So in a way, And this is where we come back to this idea of being concrete and humble, sort of show me the circle, and then we know what we'll be discussing about, and we are moving beyond the fact that it's not always clear what circular economy and circular business model and circular solutions and circular policies are about. So I think your question is important and sort of pointing at the need of being clearer even in our critique and questioning. And that I just suggested my own answer to being more concrete, which is show me your circle. And it's a very good question in my experience, because it's really starting a very good discussion with the people working with circular economy every time. This is what we want to do.
Thank you very much, Hervé and Alison, for these stimulating points. I think there is a very good question from Steve. Steve, do you want me to read it, or you want to go and slightly modify it based on the debate so far?
Hello, everyone. I can't turn my camera on, it seems. Yes, no, like my question is really, as I put it in the chat. So a major critique of the circular economy is that we're maybe optimizing the wrong type of systems, and they're not actually maybe addressing the root causes of which would enable greater transformation to our production and consumption systems to be able to, well, live in a safe and just space for humanity. But instead, we're actually trying to incrementally change the wrong type of systems and actually locking us more into those types of systems. So I was wondering if, to what extent did this come up in your paper, and what thoughts you might have on it?
Thanks, Steve. Hervé, probably.
I think that the critique, which is more systemic, is what you will find in the later part of the paper, in the part 3, when we discuss the circular economy as ideological agenda, because this is where the circular economy is more questioned, I would say, from the outside. And whereas many critics are sort of critique from the inside, saying, oh, can we make it work better? And there is some people actually who are actually challenging this in terms of the eco-modernization agenda of the circular economy, or challenging, for example, the fact that circular economy is a program for growth, and that a program for growth cannot be sustainable in the long run. So you will find some kind of more systemic critique, but I don't think it's one is dominating. There is, I would say, a large acceptance for the technical / economical understanding of society, which is underlying the circular economy. And whereas I would say the more radical political critique is still rather absent. But there is a very nice paper by Gregson and Krang where the circular economy is questioned from a moral basis, which I think is very original. And this was a very early paper too.
Sure, and yeah, if you would like to share the details in the chat, I think that would be great for everybody.
I just wanted to add, actually, to what Hervé indicated, was that I guess, you know, that's also what's coming out in the critiques around the challenges of it not being clear on how to implement the circular economy. I mean, that's a symptom that's coming across. So I just wanted to add that in too.
You also have a more radical critique against the circular economy, which has been raised by the waste people. Because in a way, the waste people, they are confronted on a daily basis with the fact that stuff ends up as waste. And they show the challenge of collecting waste. They show the challenge of avoiding that things end up in the wrong place. There's also a challenge of sort of getting things back and separating them and cleaning them. And in the way that they, well, having more things in circulation might not be the solution. That's more something, and Steve, it's not something which I really referring about from the paper. It's more from a different workshop that I've been working with on this project and another project, where the people from waste saying that we need less stuff. release less
Yeah.
material. And this is actually a practitioner understanding which is meeting the concern of ecological economics. And this view, I think, is not that represented today, but I think there are some concerns about this being raised, among other things, in geography. So geographers are very interested by the circular economy and very different approach if you compare, for example, with the Journal of Industrial Production.
Yeah, absolutely. I really share this concern, Hervé, and the fact that, you know, talking about that plurality you both were mentioning earlier, there seems to be a plurality of understanding of circular economy also across disciplines, across journals, which is, you know, something we should be aware of, definitely. Giuseppe, you wanted to add something? Please go on.
Oh yeah, if there's nobody else to, I don't want to take all the ground if there's any other question. Okay.
Oh, please go.
So yeah, because so yeah, there is a lot of contestation at academic level on, from a conceptual and a theoretical perspective on the circular economy, and it's easy to see where the support for this political agenda comes from. I mean, in one of your slides you showed IKEA, Danone. There were many businesses so actively supporting this on the political agenda. But what are the weaker points that can allow political contestation of the circular economy from the societal level? Is it the poor people? Is it are there countries that could support a different agenda, municipalities? Where do you think this repoliticization can come from?
There is a big movement around circular economy societies. So, for example, there is like the African Circular Economy Network that tries to bring different communities operating in different contexts in sub-Saharan Africa to discuss these elements. But I too think even within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation material around the circular economy, there is now a big drive connecting not only with the planetary boundaries, but Kate Raworth's donut economics and the social boundaries. But I think, you know, looking at it externally, there seems to actually, that is in some respects encouraging further confusion around what's circularity and what's sustainable development. You know, because the planetary and social boundaries is also attached with the, you know, sort of the sustainable development agenda. But I think there more has to be done in around trying to bring, as you put it, the right stakeholders in the room. You know, how do we hear those, you know, and that's one of the questions that we suggested at the end, you know, how can one create an inclusive economy? So, you know, if ever you are looking at something, Hervé's question about, you know, what is the circle, you can actually see who's included and ensure that you have the voices in the room to actually drive the social agendas, especially in some of the informal economies. That would be my take. Hervé?
Yes, and several of the critiques that we have been gathering are also actually answering to your concern, and they are critique of the eco-modernization. For example, the fact that the deterioration of material is something largely ignored, as if material could be circulated over and over and over again in some kind of endless. The question of where the energy is going to come from, the question about, of course, of the inclusion-exclusion, the question about dispersion. And in a way, several of the critiques which have been addressed to the circular economy reminds of the critiques which have been addressed to ecological modernization. And the rebound effect, for example, the fact that, okay, if we save money, if we save material by circularizing things better, what will happen with, I would say, the income which are freed and sort of free to go to somewhere else? So in a way, I think you could find a lot of similarities between the critiques that we have been gathering against the circular economy and the critiques which have been addressed to ecological modernization, because the two share something very much in common with the idea about sort of piecemeal improvement at product level, at maybe company level, you will end up with a global transformation of society. And where I think it's very interesting, and that at the same time, the circular economy very often comes with an early revolutionary rhetoric. And I'm always very surprised when I read some of the reports in, for example, even the executive summaries of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's report. It seems to be written by some kind of extremely green radical people. And we need to change completely the economy. We need a completely new economic system. We need to rethink the way we are doing business. And those are, I would say, revolutionary in the mean that it's taking some distance with all what is existing. And this is necessary, it's imperative now. And at the same time, it's very, I would say, reformist. So, and I think that's something which is interesting with the circular economy. It's sort of combining, I would say, a reformist and a revolutionary rhetoric, and within the largely, I would say, a political agenda which is comforting existing institutions and giving cooperation a central place. So this is where we are moving, and I think this is very sort of similar to the eco-modernization paradigm, which is also presenting itself as revolutionary while being reformist and with giving, among other things, market more importance.
Thank you, Hervé. Great comments from both you and Alison, and thank you, for this fantastic insight about this dichotomy about revolutionaries and reformists, which in the case of circular economy seems to have been strangely overcome. I mean, that's something I would be really keen to explore more. And Tommaso, you have a question.
Katia.
Oh, Katia. Yeah, Tommaso first and then Katia, yeah. Tommaso, to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was actually thinking now about that report you have just mentioned, because yeah, one of the points you raised is this need to pass from thinking about material flows to managing stocks, and I think in that report that need emerged quite strongly. But yeah, now if you see like how the tools they have developed, like Circularity, the level of assessment is really qualitative and superficial. Like, do you have any circular business model? Yes or no, or yeah, things like that. And so I wanted to ask you if you know any organization or think tank or that is a bit more active in measuring the process of businesses from linear to circular in a more radical way, like if you know any instrument that might have been already developed, or yeah.
Alison, you have contact with, you mentioned this report.
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, there's is it the Circle Economy group? They publish. I don't know whether there's a report that monitors businesses in terms of their radical transformation, but there is the Circularity Gap report that's published every January at the same time as the World Economic Forum for Davos. So that gives an indication of how circular the world is. And it was quite a harrowing read, if I'm honest, for this January's, in terms of providing a solution to unsustainable production and consumption practices. There also are there's a Netherlands organisation that is like the circular economy, but it's not called the circular economy. So and they too are a think tank trying to help organisations make the shift. They're a not-for-profit organisation. What I'll do is I'll have a look up. I'll look them up after this meeting and send Andrea the group of who it is, because they're quite active in that space. But there are also, you know, the different networks across different continents, the circular economy networks, which are the businesses coming together. It might be the circular economy, Andrea. I can't remember it off the top of my head. It's very close.
Yeah.
And thank you, Steve. Yes, it might be too. I'll have a look. But I'll put the circular economy networks details in the chat now. But
Thank
how
you.
radical they are, to respond also to that part, I don't know. And that I think they'll be tracking a particular understanding of circularity in circular business models.
Thank you, Alison. I think Katia is next. Probably the final question, as just conscious of time.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Hervé, Alison, and Niels for this fantastic paper, because you put in order all our doubts. It's not that we haven't reflected. I mean, as a researcher, that we are working on a circular economy. So I just want to share with you, as an economist, that when I start reading your paper, your abstract, I found myself inside there is unclear theoretical grounds. So my interest as an economist, actually, it was just to investigate, okay, how can we formalize, you know, what Hervé was saying before. Yeah, show me the circle. So I start investigating already when we start this project, basically with Andrea, and we found that there is this gap actually in the literature about contribution from economists. So we didn't find any paper published in economic journals. So there was one important aspect. But as economists,
excuse me, Katia, when you mean economists, you mean people from economics?
For economy, and then, you know, you find a lots of articles, even written by economists, but in more interdisciplinary journal than in a pure economic journal. Anyway, yeah, I as economist, I was interested actually to investigate this aspect. So I found, you may correct me if I miss some updated, but I found 3 or 4 papers. They were dealing with the theoretical, you know, development of this circular economy framework. So one was by George Donald. I mean, there were many authors, and this was published in Economic Modeling and Software. And then it was a model, if I remember well, that incorporates two types of resources, like pollution inputs and recycled input. Then there was another paper from Dinda, I think it was Indian economist, but it's a working paper, so he hasn't published yet. So, but is within the framework of endogenous economics growth. Then I found another one from Garcia, was the main author, Barragan and others, and he was published in ecological economics, and he defined in a measure of circular economy a mathematical approach. With, I have to say, with the inambiguous some definition of circular economy. And then I found another one written by, I think it was Danish, Sorensen. He used like a Ramsey model with the exhaustible natural resource to study basically the optimal recycle of pollution, raw materials, and household waste product. So as economist, I thought like, oh, maybe I can start develop something like start with try develop, you know, a theoretical. Me too. I can make an attempt to develop a theoretical model, and I found what actually Hervé was saying. So I tried first. I start with the new definition of the production function. So I try to put myself like in the production side, and then from the consumer side. But I start reflecting as you like, okay, but is this production process works for everyone? And then I end up, as you said, how many times I have to be the loop, because in the output. So I found it not easy. I ended up with some idea that I tried to submit, honestly, and So in one paper was rejected, another one went under review, and then it was like, yeah, rejected. So maybe I was like an heretic person to start thinking outside the box, let's put it this way. But the editor actually said that, well, like, I think that we really need to start formalize something. But I guess that we have to maybe make a little bit more limits or outline. I mean, where, in which particular production process we apply this, and then actually he want to see. That's what the editor replied to me. You have to show me when you close the loop how you internalized, these environmental. What actually you are arguing basically. So I thought it was easier when I start thinking, okay, let's make some attempt, see what the other has done, what I can do. This is really, a novelty in this field. It's not as easy as I thought. So I'm still thinking that is my idea to try as economists to develop some theoretical background, but well, I don't know. I'm a little bit discouraged now. Then I discovered this paper. It was sent by Andrea, and then I started reading. I was like, wow, yes, these are lots of some of our doubts when we read and when we promote circular economy. So I was, as economist, really touched with this unclear theoretical, grounds. It was like, yeah, we haven't developed, we haven't formalized. We don't have. Probably this comes from different definition and different field, probably from different subject. So I don't have a particular question. This was my experience. So I found myself, I recognize myself in this criticism. Sorry, I'm done. Sorry, it was a little bit long. So
thank you, Katia.
Thank you for I thank you for the paper.
The short answer to this, I think that if you're really interested in the view of economists, and by economics I mean people dealing with economics, not people dealing with management, not business economists, I think that I would go back to Peace and Turner, and Peace and Turner, the book by Peace and Turner has been cited thousands and thousands of times, so it might be difficult. But I think that this is where, because you will be there, and while you were speaking, I got very rapidly, I checked my own database, and I can only find papers in publishing something with economics in the title of the journal, and circular somewhere in ecological economics. And I think this is where the debate is. You will find a debate about the circular economy among economists in ecological economics.
Exactly, that's why I said my paper.
Yes, and I'm not even sure you will find much about it in environmental economics. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the circular economy is still very limited to a certain amount of micro discourses, So you have it in the Journal of Cleaner Production, you will have it in the Journal of Ecological Economics of Industrial Ecology. But I think that before you find something about the circular economy in mainstream journal in economics, it's just as little as when you will find things about the circular economy in mainstream journal about management. But I think the debate will be the economists in economics interest within the circular economy. You will find them in ecological economics. Other people following Peace and Turner book. That would be my two suggestions.
Yeah, I tried to submit there. In fact, I got these comments from the editor, because I thought that would be the first,
Thank you very much, Katia, for this remark, and Hervé for your insights. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, so it's almost 6:30 in Central European summer, still for a few days, summertime, so time to call it a day. So thank you very much, Hervé and Alison. It has been a great presentation, a great debate, and of course, I mean, we have also recorded this interaction we have had and with your permission, I mean, we will send it to you first, and then we might also publish this in the YouTube channel of the Retrace project, if you agree with it. Of course, we will share the first version of the video with you first, in such a way you can check whether there is something controversial that you don't want us to share. Okay, so thank you very much also for this rich reference list that you have shared with us. I'll be making sure that I am downloading the chat as a text file in such a way that this won't get lost, and we will keep in touch. So it will be our pleasure to invite you both to some future events of the Retrace network. We also hope in person if the COVID situation improves. And also, I mean, we will share with you some insights about the other recent projects that we have launched, which is called Just to See a Just Transition Towards a Circular Economy, which tries to address some of the concerns Alison was mentioning at the beginning about the North-South divide in the transition towards the circular economy, which is very often neglected. So thank you very much to everybody, and talk to you all soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye from Sweden.
Goodbye from the UK.
Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye from Italy.